Hello, hello, hello. Hi, thank you so much for having me on here today. And I'm so sorry I couldn't make it there in person, but I'll get right to it. My my state of mind a couple of months ago when I first received the invitation to speak to you all. Yes, I think, can you hear me? My mic is on? Yes? Awesome. All right, great stuff. So I was talking about my state of mind. A couple of months ago when I was invited to speak to you today, I find now that my state of mind has completely changed from what it was a couple of months ago and what it is today. And that is because in recent weeks I've been feeling like uncertain, unsafe, anxious, all the feelings that I felt back home in Nigeria. I feel them now here in the United States with all that I see. And it worries me because I find that it is easy to miss or to take for granted what one has never experienced. And in this case, which is a failing or a failed democracy. One of the core tenets of democracy is freedom. The freedom to express, to leave, to convene. And any state that attempts to or actually strips you of that right or any of that right, any other right, ceases to be a practice in democracy. Nigeria, unfortunately, is such a state. For years, young Nigerians have been victims of police brutality, especially from a unit called SARS, which stands for Special Anti-Robbery Squad. Their goal, of course, is as the name implies. But what SARS became known for was targeting young Nigerians for the dumbest reasons you can possibly imagine. For example, having dreadlocks, wearing ripped jeans, walking around with a laptop, basically looking cool. And so we had had enough. And we took to the streets in a nationwide protest in what we called End SARS. Now, young Nigerians, unfortunately, had been tortured, extorted, beaten, thrown in jail, especially if that extortion was unsuccessful, raped, and in many cases, killed. And this really fueled our protests around the nation. But on the 20th of October 2020, while we were gathered at the now infamous Lekki toll gate, which is one of the locations for the protests, we're hoping that the culmination of all our peaceful protests would be met by the government responding to our demands of ending SARS and reforming our police force. The government did respond all right, but it was a response that we never imagined. That evening, while I was speaking to thousands of young Nigerians, out of nowhere, gunshots rang, like AK-47s. And I could see people scrambling, jumping over themselves, trying to get to safety. There were just so many people. And initially, nobody knew exactly what was happening, right? But it was happening really fast. And yet slow enough to capture information, if that makes any sense. Now, at this point, with the gunshots still ringing, I could now tell that it was coming from behind me as I faced the crowd this way. And so I ducked, of course, and I had the microphone in hand and I screamed, brace, brace, brace. And as they drew nearer, I was shocked, as I believe many protesters were, because what I saw were soldiers, Nigerian soldiers, shooting into a peaceful crowd. And in that moment, it hit me that our government sent in the army to kill its citizens for peacefully protesting the brutality that we'd been enduring for years. You know, I've always been taught that singing the national anthem where our soldiers were lets them know that we're not the enemy. And so I'm still holding the mic. I screamed into the mic to the protesters that were around, braced, seated, to sing the national anthem, which we all did in unison. But It didn't stop the soldiers from shooting into the crowd. Now, in my last-ditch effort to to do something crazy in the moment, and even crazy when I think about it now, is that I whipped out my phone and decided to go live on Instagram. In that moment, I truly thought that was my last day on earth, and I just wanted to show people what was happening, where it happened, and where, I possibly would die. But in moments, just a few moments, the live stream went viral. To misquote the great Kendrick Lamar, my live stream just went viral. All right, that was for the students. I'll keep it moving. But we had news networks from all over the world tune into that live stream, and I think that was probably why the shooting stopped. I don't know. Now, those of us that survived, we witnessed soldiers throwing bodies onto the truck, onto their trucks rather. A lot of protesters that were hit in the leg or elsewhere. And people on the live had called ambulances to come to our location, but the soldiers wouldn't let them through. And then some of us became what you would call makeshift doctors. We also watched how the soldiers scampered around to pick up their shells. And so we ran around as well, trying to pick up shells for proof. And, I put some of those shells in between my shirt because I had nowhere else to hold them. And then moments later, I think maybe an hour later or so, my phone died. And eventually the soldiers left. Now, this might sound weird to you, but in that moment, we felt victorious. Again, it might not make any sense to you, but we felt victorious. But unbeknownst to us, that was just the first wave. The second wave, when we heard another set of gunshots firing into the survivors left at the Lekki toll gate, we realized that this was now being done by members of the Nigerian police force. Now, I'm sorry. It was a massacre. In the days leading to my exit, and by exit I mean smuggled out of my country, what happened was my government tried so hard to get me to keep quiet. I refused. Then they tried to get me to change my story. I refused as well. And when all their tactics didn't work, they moved to discredit me by targeting my character. They claimed that I was a terrorist. They also claimed that I was part of the Biafra movement. Now, the Biafra movement in Nigeria is a secessionist group, right? And they happen to come from the same region that I come from. And so that was the connection that they were trying to make. On top of all that, the government tried their very best to change the narrative of what everyone saw and witnessed with their own eyes, claiming that my Instagram live stream was, wait for it, CGI. CGI, like in the movies. It doesn't surprise me because, again, these are the steps that authoritative regimes take. And Nigeria keeps up this facade that it's a democracy, but we know that in a truly democratic society, this would have never happened. And I know democracy, for all its strengths and benefits, when it is under attack and nobody stands for it, it becomes like a fragile glass, very easy to break. And that's why, even as the government were somewhat successful at convincing those with eyes to become blind, despite their power and intimidation tactics, I knew we had to hold them accountable. And so, yes, it took a couple of years and a lot of pain and stress, but I and two other survivors and a group of very wonderful pro bono lawyers came together and we took the government to the West African Regional Court of Justice. It's called the ECOWAS. Now think of the ECOWAS like your Supreme Court, right? But like the Supreme Court of for West African states on the continent. So that's what ECOWAS is. Now the case was long. There were scary times in it, but With undeniable evidence and testimony, we ultimately won. And so in July of 2024, the ECOWAS court ruled that the Nigerian government used disproportionate force and that security forces opened fire on peaceful protesters in a violent crackdown. And then the court also ordered the Nigerian government to pay compensation to the victims, the survivors, and also to investigate and deliver accountability within 6 months. Hold up, August, September, October, November, December, January, nothing. Now look, I'm not surprised. I don't expect them to live up to the judgment. It's not a democracy after all. But there's a win here, which is their crimes are on the record. You know, when I think of my mom and how worried and scared she was, happy that I'm safe, but really scared. She had no idea why I was doing what I was doing. And I said to her, I said, it's very important, Mom, that we speak up whenever we can. We have to stand up in whatever capacity that we can. I was scared too, but I was angry. For the young men and women we lost, I was angry. For the families that have one less child at that dinner table, I was angry. For the trauma of our young generation today and their fear of expression in my country, Nigeria, I'm still pretty much angry. And that's why we had to see the case through to the ends of where the law would allow. Now, democracy I know can be a chore, but at least it welcomes participation. It's representative. Winston Churchill said, and I quote, "Democracy is the worst form of government that have been tried." End quote. For people like us that have lived through authoritative and dictatorship regimes, we understood Winston's quote clearly. And that's why this win against an authoritative regime back in Nigeria is good, but it is only an injury to authoritative, or rather authoritarianism. In order to overcome it, it would include and it would take all of us to do so. So I urge you today, in whatever ways, creative or otherwise, please stay engaged. Encourage your friends to stay engaged. Educate yourselves. Know your facts. Elevate your critical thinking. Study democracies, other democracies, and look for the indicators that show whether a democracy is under pressure, under attack, or it is failing. Listen to more stories from people like me if you can. Do all of this, please, so you don't have to find yourself in another country sharing your story. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your event. Cheers.